Welcome, weary travelers, to a collection of stories that will both chill your bones and soothe your restless mind. Tonight, we embark on a journey through 5 true tales of terror that unfolded on America's endless highways, where the familiar becomes foreign and the ordinary transforms into the extraordinary. These aren't just stories meant to frighten. They're carefully woven narratives designed to carry you gently into sleep, like a lullaby wrapped in shadows. There's something uniquely comforting about scary stories told in the right tone at the right pace. The human voice, steady and rhythmic, becomes an anchor in the darkness, guiding you through tales of the unknown, while paradoxically offering safety in its consistency. These road trip encounters, each verified and documented, speak to our deepest fears about venturing into the unknown, yet they also remind us of our resilience and our ability to survive even the most unsettling experiences. As you settle into your bed tonight, allow these stories to wash over you like the gentle hum of tires on asphalt, the soft whisper of wind through an open car window on a late-night drive. Let the rhythm of each tale carry you deeper into relaxation, even as the content sends delicious shivers down your spine. The American road system stretches across nearly 4 million miles of highways, byways, and forgotten routes that connect our vast continent. Each year, millions of travelers venture out onto these ribbons of asphalt, seeking adventure, visiting loved ones, or simply trying to get from point A to point B. But within this network of normalcy, something extraordinary happens with surprising frequency. Encounters that defy explanation, moments that linger in memory long after the trip has ended. Statistical analysis of paranormal reporting agencies shows that approximately 23% of unexplained encounters occur during road travel, a percentage far higher than would be expected given the relatively small amount of time most people spend driving long distances. Perhaps it's the isolation, the liminal space between destinations, or the way darkness transforms familiar landscapes into alien territories. Whatever the cause, the road has become a theater for the inexplicable. Picture, if you will, the moment when daylight fades and your headlights become the only illumination cutting through an endless tunnel of darkness. The world shrinks to the cone of light before you, and everything beyond that border becomes mystery. The radio crackles with distant stations, voices from far-off cities speaking to listeners you'll never meet. Your fuel gauge slowly descends and the miles between gas stations stretch longer than they should. This is when the ordinary rules of existence seem to bend, when the impossible becomes merely improbable. The vulnerability of the road traveler cannot be overstated. Miles from the nearest town, with nothing but a thin sheet of metal and glass separating you from the vast wilderness, you become acutely aware of your own mortality. It's in these moments of heightened awareness that the human mind becomes most receptive to experiences that would otherwise be dismissed. The road strips away our urban defenses, our comfortable assumptions about how the world works, leaving us open to encounters that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The autumn air carried a bite that penetrated even the warmest jacket, as Sarah Martinez loaded her Honda Civic for the drive from Denver to her grandmother's house in rural Wyoming. It was October 15th, 2019, and the weather forecast promised clear skies for the 2,000-mile journey she'd made countless times before. Sarah, a 22-year-old graphic designer, had been making this trip monthly for the past 2 years, ever since her grandmother's health had begun to decline. She knew every curve of Route 287, every exit, every landmark that marked her progress northward. The drive began uneventfully, as it always did. Sarah's playlist of familiar songs provided a comforting soundtrack as she navigated through the suburbs of Denver and onto the open highway. The sun hung low in the October sky, painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber. She'd timed the trip perfectly. She would arrive at her grandmother's house just as the sun was setting in time for their traditional dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes. But as the miles passed, Sarah noticed something peculiar. The usually busy highway seemed unusually empty. For stretches of 10, 15, even 20 miles, she saw no other vehicles. The radio, which normally picked up several stations clearly along this route, produced only static punctuated by occasional bursts of unclear voices speaking in what sounded like foreign languages. She adjusted the dial repeatedly, but the familiar stations remained elusive. The first sign that this journey would be different from all the others came at mile marker 1 and 3 there. Just as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, Sarah noticed a figure standing beside the road ahead. A woman in what appeared to be a light-colored dress, her arm extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. This was unusual for several reasons. Sarah had never encountered hitchhikers on this particular stretch of highway. The woman was remarkably underdressed for the cold October evening, and something about her posture seemed wrong, as if she were standing too straight, too stiff. As Sarah approached, she slowed her vehicle, her natural inclination toward helping others warring with the practical caution her parents had instilled in her about picking up strangers. The woman appeared to be young, perhaps in her 20s, with long dark hair that hung perfectly straight despite the wind that Sarah could see affecting the roadside grass. Her dress was white or cream-colored, simple in design, and seemed to be made of a thin material wholly inappropriate for the weather. Sarah pulled over about 50 feet past the woman, her hands trembling slightly as she shifted into park. Through her rear-view mirror, she watched the figure begin walking toward her car. The woman's gait was odd, too smooth, as if she were gliding rather than walking. Sarah's rational mind supplied explanations. Perhaps the woman was in shock. Maybe she'd been in an accident and was walking strangely due to injury. When the woman reached the passenger side window, Sarah rolled it down partway. Up close, the hitchhiker appeared even younger, perhaps 19 or 20, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the fading daylight. Her eyes were dark, so dark that Sarah couldn't distinguish the iris from the pupil, and they held an expression of desperate sadness that immediately evoked sympathy. "Thank you for stopping," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. "I need to get to Laramie. My family is waiting for me." Sarah's heart went out to the young woman. Laramie was only about 30 miles out of her way, and the woman's situation seemed genuinely desperate. Despite her usual caution, Sarah found herself nodding. "Of course, get in." The woman opened the door and slid into the passenger seat with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. She closed the door gently, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead through the windshield. Sarah noticed that despite the cold evening air, the woman showed no signs of being chilled, no shivering, no goosebumps on her bare arms. "What's your name?" Sarah asked as she pulled back onto the highway. "Elena," the woman replied without turning her head. "Elena Vasquez. I'm Sarah. What happened to your car?" For a long moment, Elena didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice seemed to come from a great distance. "There was an accident. A long time ago." Something about the way Elena said "a long time ago" sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she attributed it to the woman's obvious distress. Trauma could affect people in strange ways, making recent events feel distant, distorting their perception of time. As they drove, Sarah attempted to make conversation, but Elena's responses became increasingly monosyllabic. The woman stared straight ahead, occasionally whispering something in what sounded like Spanish, though Sarah's limited knowledge of the language prevented her from understanding the words. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop several degrees, and Sarah turned up the heat, though Elena showed no reaction to the cold. Mile marker 2000 passed outside the window, then 25, then 210. Sarah realized they should have reached the Laramie exit by now, but the familiar landmarks seemed to be taking longer to appear than usual. She glanced at her GPS, but the screen showed only a blank map with no road markers or current location indicator. The device seemed to be malfunctioning, displaying only a message that read, "Searching for signal." "Elena," Sarah said, her voice betraying a growing unease. "Are you sure about the exit? I feel like we should have reached Laramie by now." When Elena didn't respond, Sarah glanced over at the passenger seat. The woman was staring at her with those impossibly dark eyes, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw something move in their depths, like shadows dancing behind black glass. "The exit is coming," Elena said, her voice now carrying an odd echo, as if she were speaking from inside a tunnel. "Just ahead." Sarah looked back at the road and saw an exit ramp that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The sign read Laramie, 2 miles. But something about the lettering looked wrong, as if it had been painted with a brush rather than manufactured. The exit ramp itself seemed to curve away from the highway at an impossible angle, disappearing into darkness that appeared thicker than the surrounding night. Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed at her not to take that exit. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she approached the off-ramp, her foot hovering over the brake pedal. But Elena's presence in the car seemed to exert a strange influence, and Sarah found herself turning onto the ramp despite her mounting terror. The ramp led not to a road but to what appeared to be an old highway, cracked and overgrown with weeds. Ancient telephone poles lined the road, their wires long since fallen or never installed. The headlights illuminated perhaps 50 feet ahead, beyond which lay impenetrable darkness. Sarah's speedometer showed she was traveling at 45 miles per hour, but the sensation was of moving much slower, as if the car were pushing through thick liquid. "Stop here," Elena said suddenly. Sarah pressed the brake and the car came to a halt in the middle of the desolate road. To their right stood what appeared to be the ruins of a small building, perhaps a gas station or diner from decades past. The structure was partially collapsed, its walls black with age and weather damage. A rusted sign hung at an angle from a single chain, too corroded to read. "This is where I need to be," Elena said, turning to face Sarah fully for the first time since entering the car. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, her face appeared gaunt, almost skeletal, and her dark eyes seemed to hold depths that no human eyes should possess. "Elena, there's nothing here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "This looks like it's been abandoned for years." Elena smiled, an expression that was somehow both beautiful and terrifying. "Not abandoned, just waiting." She reached over and placed her hand on Sarah's arm. The touch was ice cold, so cold that it seemed to burn through the fabric of Sarah's jacket and into her skin. "Thank you for bringing me home," Elena said. "I've been trying to get back for so long." With that, Elena opened the passenger door and stepped out into the darkness. Sarah watched in the rearview mirror as the woman walked toward the ruined building, her white dress glowing faintly in the night. Just before Elena disappeared into the shadows of the collapsed structure, she turned back and waved. For a brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw not a young woman, but a skeleton in a rotting dress, its empty eye sockets somehow still managing to convey that expression of desperate sadness. Sarah's hands shook as she put the car in reverse and backed away from the ruins. She turned around as quickly as she could manage on the narrow road and drove back toward what she hoped was the highway. The return trip seemed to take hours, though her clock showed only minutes had passed. When she finally reached what appeared to be Route T7, she drove for another hour before stopping at a well-lit gas station to collect herself. Inside the station, she approached the elderly clerk behind the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice still trembling. "I think I took a wrong exit back there." There was a sign for Laramie, but it led to some kind of abandoned road. The clerk looked at her with concern. "Miss, there ain't no exit to Laramie for another 40 miles north of here. Haven't been for years, not since they rerouted the highway back in '98. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this information. "But I just came from there. There was a woman who needed a ride." The clerk's expression grew more serious. "What did this woman look like?" Sarah described Elena in detail. The white dress, the dark hair, the pale skin, the strange eyes. As she spoke, she watched the color drain from the clerk's face. "Miss," he said quietly, "you need to sit down for a minute." He guided her to a chair near the coffee machine. "What you just described, that sounds like Elena Vasquez. But Elena died in a car accident on that old stretch of highway 23 years ago. She was trying to get home to Laramie to see her family when she skidded off the road during a snowstorm. They found her car wrapped around a tree, and her body about 50 feet away like she'd been thrown clear. Sarah's hands went cold. "That's impossible. I just had her in my car. She was talking to me." The clerk nodded grimly. "You're not the first person to tell me that story. Every few years, someone comes in here with the same tale. Young woman in a white dress, needs a ride to Laramie, leads them to that old abandoned road where the accident happened. Some folks say she's still trying to get home, still trying to reach her family." Sarah remained at the gas station for another hour, drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened. The clerk, whose name was Frank, showed her newspaper clippings from 1996 about the accident, including a photograph of Elena Vasquez. It was unmistakably the same woman who had ridden in Sarah's passenger seat. When she finally continued her journey to her grandmother's house, Sarah drove with all the windows down, despite the cold, needing the fresh air to convince herself that she was still among the living. She arrived 3 hours later than planned, her grandmother waiting with cold pot roast and warm concern. Sarah never took that route again, choosing instead to drive an extra 50 miles through a different series of highways to reach her grandmother's house. But she never forgot Elena Vasquez, the young woman who had been trying to get home for over 2 decades, trapped in an endless loop of seeking help from passing strangers. The experience changed Sarah's perspective on the nature of reality, on the thin barriers between life and death, and on the power of unfinished business to transcend the boundaries of the physical world. She often wondered if Elena ever made it home, if the families of the departed somehow know when their loved ones are still wandering the earth, searching for closure that may never come. Marcus Thompson had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. When he encountered something on Interstate 80 that would forever change his understanding of the world. A veteran of countless midnight runs across America's highways, Marcus prided himself on his practical nature and his ability to stay alert during the long, lonely hours between cities. At 42, he had seen everything the road could throw at a driver: severe weather, mechanical failures, aggressive motorists, and the occasional wildlife encounter. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what happened during a routine run from Salt Lake City to Des Moines in June. The load was nothing special. A trailer full of furniture bound for a distribution center in Iowa. Marcus had picked up the shipment on a Tuesday morning, and his delivery schedule allowed for a comfortable 3-day drive with mandatory rest stops. He was traveling in his 2016 Kenworth T680, a reliable truck that had never given him serious trouble, equipped with the latest GPS navigation and communication equipment. The first 2 days of the journey passed without incident. Marcus made good time across Utah and Colorado, stopped for his required rest periods, and maintained radio contact with his dispatcher and other drivers on the road. He was an experienced member of the trucking community, part of an informal network of professional drivers who looked out for each other, sharing information about road conditions, weather, and the occasional speed trap. It was on the 3rd day, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, that Marcus first noticed something unusual about his radio. He was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of I-80, with cornfields extending to the horizon on both sides of the highway, when he realized that his CB radio was picking up voices that shouldn't have been there. At first, he assumed it was interference from a distant station or atmospheric conditions affecting radio propagation. But as he listened more carefully, Marcus realized that the voices were speaking in English, and they seemed to be having conversations that made no logical sense. "The cornfield remembers everything," said a woman's voice, clear as if she were sitting in his passenger seat. "Every secret buried in the rose, every promise broken under the moon." A man's voice responded, equally clear: "The harvest won't come this year. The earth is too tired, too full of what it's trying to forget." Marcus adjusted his radio, switching channels, but the voices followed him across the frequency. They weren't broadcasting on any specific channel. They seemed to exist in the spaces between channels, in the static that normally carried nothing but electronic noise. "Driver, you're listening to us," said a child's voice, and Marcus nearly swerved off the highway in shock. The voice was addressing him directly, somehow aware of his presence despite the fact that he hadn't transmitted anything on his radio. Marcus grabbed his microphone, his hands trembling as he keyed it. "Who is this? How do you know I'm listening?" The response came not from one voice, but from many, overlapping and weaving together into a chorus that seemed to emerge from the very air around him. We're the ones who never made it home. We're the voices of the lost, the forgotten, the ones who disappeared into the darkness between the mile markers. The truck's interior suddenly felt much colder, despite the June heat outside. Marcus checked his air conditioning, but it wasn't running. The temperature drop seemed to come from nowhere, as if the cab were being invaded by something that carried winter with it. "I don't understand," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice barely steady. "What do you want?" "Listen," came the reply, now in the voice of an elderly man. "Listen to what the road remembers. Listen to the stories that the pavement holds." What followed was the most terrifying hour of Marcus's life. Through his radio speakers came a stream of voices, each telling a fragment of a story about disappearance, about people who had vanished while traveling America's highways. The voices spoke of cars found abandoned with their engines still running, of trucks discovered empty at rest stops with meals still warm on the dashboard, of families who had simply vanished between 1 mile marker and the next. A teenage girl's voice described getting separated from her friends during a road trip in 1987, wandering into a truck stop bathroom and never coming out the other side. Her body never found, despite extensive searches. An elderly man spoke of pulling over to help what he thought was a stranded motorist, only to find himself lost in a landscape that no longer resembled the highway he had been traveling. Each story was specific, detailed, and spoke to Marcus with the authenticity of lived experience. The voices knew details that only the missing persons themselves could have known. The contents of their pockets, their final thoughts, the names of loved ones they had been trying to reach. "We're still here," said a woman who claimed to have been a nurse from Phoenix, traveling to her daughter's wedding in Denver when her car broke down in the middle of nowhere. "We're all still here, in the space between leaving and arriving, caught in the eternal journey." Marcus tried to turn off the radio, but the voices continued. He unplugged the power cable, but somehow the speakers kept broadcasting the ghostly chorus. Even when he pulled the fuse for the entire radio system, the voices persisted, seeming to emanate from the metal structure of the truck itself. "You can't silence us," laughed a child's voice. "We're part of the road now. We're in the steel and the concrete, in the white lines that guide you through the darkness. Every highway in America carries our whispers." The sun began to set as Marcus continued driving, and with the approaching darkness, the voices grew stronger and more numerous. They began to overlap, creating a cacophony of lost souls all trying to tell their stories simultaneously. Marcus could distinguish dozens of different voices, all speaking at once, creating a sound like a supernatural radio station that broadcast nothing but the final words of the disappear. As night fell completely, Marcus noticed that his headlights seemed to be illuminating things that weren't there during the day. In the cornfields that lined the highway, he could see figures standing motionless between the rows, pale, translucent shapes that appeared to be watching his truck pass. Some of the figures raised their hands in greeting. Others simply stood and stared with expressions of infinite sadness. "Do you see us now?" asked a voice from the radio. "Do you see how many of us there are?" Marcus realized that the figures in the cornfields were not random apparitions. They were the sources of the voices on his radio. Each pale figure corresponded to one of the stories he had been hearing, visual manifestations of the lost souls who had been speaking to him throughout the evening. The truck's GPS system began to malfunction, showing his location as a series of question marks and displaying a map that seemed to shift and change as he watched. According to the device, he was simultaneously in Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and several other states, as if his truck were existing in multiple locations at once. "The road doesn't follow your maps," explained a voice that claimed to belong to a geologist who had disappeared while conducting research on highway construction in the 1970s. "The road follows its own geography, connects places that were never meant to be connected. We exist in the spaces your maps can't show." Marcus's fuel gauge showed that he should have been running low, but somehow his tank remained full. His odometer indicated that he had been driving for hundreds of miles, but the mile markers on the highway seemed to be repeating, showing the same numbers over and over again. "You're in our space now," said the chorus of voices. "You're traveling the ghost highway, the road that exists parallel to the one you think you know." Panic began to set in as Marcus realized that he might be trapped in the same fate as the voices that were speaking to him. He tried to pull over, but every time he moved toward an exit ramp, it seemed to fade away before he could reach it, like a mirage dissolving as he approached it. "Don't be afraid," said a gentle voice that claimed to belong to a grandmother who had been driving to visit her grandchildren when she vanished in 1995. "We're not trying to keep you here. We just want someone to remember us, someone to carry our stories back to the world of the living." "But how do I get back?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking with fear and exhaustion. "Tell our stories," replied the chorus. "Promise to remember us, to let people know that we're still here, still trying to find our way home. Promise to be our voice in the world you're returning to." Marcus made the promise, speaking it aloud into the microphone with all the sincerity he could muster. As soon as the words left his lips, the voices began to fade, becoming quieter and more distant. The figures in the cornfield started to dissolve, turning transparent and then disappearing entirely. His truck systems gradually returned to normal. The GPS relocated him on Interstate 80 in Nebraska, exactly where he should have been according to his logbook. The radio fell silent except for the normal chatter of truck drivers coordinating with each other about road conditions and traffic. But Marcus was no longer the same man who had started that journey. He carried with him the weight of dozens of stories, the responsibility of being a witness to the disappeared. He began to research the names and details he had heard, discovering that many of the missing persons described by the voices were real people who had vanished under mysterious circumstances along America's highways. Some of the cases dated back decades, cold investigations that had long since been closed due to lack of evidence. Others were more recent, families still searching for answers about loved ones who had simply vanished during routine trips. Marcus found himself compelled to contact these families, sharing what he had learned in the hope that it might provide some measure of comfort. The experience changed Marcus's relationship with the road. He became more aware of the countless stories carried by America's highway system, more conscious of the thin line between safely reaching one's destination and disappearing into the vast spaces between cities. He installed additional safety equipment in his truck, maintained more frequent contact with his dispatcher, and always kept his promise to remember the voices that had spoken to him from the start. Marcus continued trucking for 3 more years after the incident, but he never again drove that particular stretch of I-80 in Nebraska. When his road required him to pass through that area, he would take alternative highways, adding hundreds of miles to his journey rather than risk another encounter with the ghost highway. He eventually retired from long-haul trucking and opened a small garage in his hometown, but he never stopped researching the stories of the disappeared. His office wall is covered with newspaper clippings, missing person posters, and maps marking the locations where people vanished along America's highways. He maintains a blog where he shares these stories, keeping his promise to be a voice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Marcus's experience serves as a reminder that the American highway system is more than just a network of roads. It's a repository of human experience, holding within its asphalt and concrete the memories of millions of journeys, both completed and forever interrupted. The voices in the static may have fallen silent for him, but Marcus knows they're still out there, still trying to tell their stories to anyone willing to listen. Jennifer and David Kim had been married for 8 years when they decided to take their first cross-country road trip together. Both successful professionals in their early 30s. Jennifer worked as a pediatric nurse and David as a software engineer. They had spent years talking about exploring America beyond their comfortable life in Seattle, when David's startup was acquired by a larger company, providing them with both the financial security and the time off they needed. They finally decided to make their dream journey a reality. Their plan was ambitious but carefully organized. They would drive from Seattle to Miami over the course of 3 weeks, taking scenic routes and stopping at national parks, historical sites, and quirky roadside attractions. David had researched the trip extensively, creating detailed itineraries, booking accommodations in advance, and mapping out routes that would take them through some of the most beautiful and interesting parts of the country. The first week of their journey exceeded all expectation. They marveled at the grandeur of Yellowstone, explored the otherworldly landscapes of Utah's national parks, and spent romantic evenings watching sunsets over the Grand Canyon. Their social media feeds filled with stunning photographs and enthusiastic updates about their adventure. By all accounts, they were living their perfect American road trip. It was during their second week, while driving through a particularly remote section of rural Texas, that Jennifer and David encountered something that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of reality. They had been driving for several hours along a two-lane highway that seemed to stretch endlessly through flat, scrubland terrain. The GPS showed they were about 2 hours away from their planned overnight stop in a small town called Millerville, where David had booked them a room at what the internet described as a charming historic bed and breakfast. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and the highway was deserted except for their rental car, a reliable Honda Accord that had served them well throughout their journey. Jennifer was dozing in the passenger seat while David drove, the radio playing softly in the background. The only lights visible were their headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional distant glow of a ranch house or oil derrick. It was Jennifer who first spotted the unexpected sight that would change everything. She had awakened from her nap and was stretching in her seat when she noticed a warm, inviting glow appearing ahead of them on the right side of the highway. "David, look at that," she said, pointing through the windshield. "Is that a restaurant?" David squinted through the darkness and saw what Jennifer was referring to, a small building set back from the highway, surrounded by several cars and illuminated by what appeared to be neon signage. As they drew closer, they could make out the distinctive architecture of a classic American diner, complete with large windows, a chrome exterior, and a sign that read "Starlight Diner" in cursive neon letters. "That's weird," David said, slowing the car as they approached. "I don't remember seeing this on any of the maps or travel guides." Jennifer consulted their road atlas, running her finger along their route. "There's nothing marked here. According to this, we shouldn't see any businesses for another 40 miles. The diner appeared to be busy, with at least a dozen cars in the parking lot, and warm light streaming from the windows. Through the glass, they could see the silhouettes of customers sitting at booths and counter stools, and the movement of wait staff bustling between tables. "I'm actually pretty hungry," Jennifer admitted. "We haven't eaten since that gas station sandwich 6 hours ago." David checked his watch. It was 11:30 p.m., which seemed late for a diner in such a remote location to be so busy. But perhaps it was a popular stop for truck drivers and other travelers. He turned into the parking lot, finding a space between a vintage Ford pickup truck and a sedan that looked like it had been manufactured sometime in the night. As they walked toward the entrance, Jennifer noticed something odd about the other vehicles in the parking lot. While they represented a variety of makes and models from different decades, they all appeared to be in pristine condition, as if they had just rolled off the showroom floor. Despite their obvious age, even more unusual, none of the license plates were from Texas, where they currently were, or from any neighboring states. She saw plates from Maine, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii, places that seemed impossibly far from this remote stretch of Texas highway. The diner's exterior was exactly what one would expect from a classic American roadside restaurant, with chrome trim that gleamed under the neon lights and large windows that offered a clear view of the interior. A small bell timed as David opened the door, and they were greeted by the comforting sounds and smells of a busy diner, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the clink of silverware against plates, and the low murmur of conversation from the other patron. The interior was a perfect recreation of a 1950s diner, with red vinyl booths, a long counter lined with chrome stools, and a black and white checkered floor that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Behind the counter, they could see into the kitchen, where a cook in a white apron was expertly managing multiple orders on a large griddle. "Seat yourselves anywhere you'd like, folks," called out a waitress who appeared to be in her 50s, wearing a pink uniform and a name tag that read Bet. She had the kind of warm, motherly demeanor that made customers feel immediately welcome. Jennifer and David chose a booth near the window, where they could watch the highway and see their car in the parking lot. As they settled into the comfortable seats, Jennifer picked up the menu from the table. It was a single page, laminated and featuring classic diner fare: burgers, fries, milkshakes, and pie. The prices seemed remarkably low, even for rural Texas. "Everything on this menu is under $5, Jennifer whispered to David. "Even the steak dinner is only $4. David examined his own menu, noting the same unusually low price. "Maybe it's an old menu they never updated," he suggested, though the prices seemed too low even for a rural diner that hadn't changed its rates in years. Betty approached their table with a coffee pot and 2 cups. "Coffee to start you folks off?" "Yes, please," Jennifer replied. "This is a lovely place. How long has it been here?" Betty poured their coffee with a practiced hand. "Oh, the Starlight's been serving travelers for longer than I can remember. We get folks from all over. People on their way to somewhere else, looking for a good meal and a friendly face." As Betty spoke, Jennifer noticed something unusual about the other customers in the diner. While they were engaged in normal activities, eating, drinking coffee, having quiet conversations, there was something slightly off about them that she couldn't quite identify. They all seemed to be dressed in clothing that was slightly out of date, not dramatically so, but as if they were wearing styles from previous decades. A family in one booth appeared to be from the 1980s, based on their clothing and hairstyle. The man wore a plaid shirt and had a mustache that hadn't been fashionable in years, while the woman's hair was styled in a way that Jennifer associated with her mother's old photographs. Their children, 2 boys who appeared to be around 10 and 12 years old, were dressed in clothes that looked like they had come from a vintage store. At the counter, an elderly man in overalls was eating pie and reading a newspaper. Jennifer tried to glimpse the date on the paper, but from her angle she could only see that it appeared to be yellowed with age, as if it had been printed decades ago. "Have you decided what you'd like?" Betty asked, interrupting Jennifer's observation. David ordered a cheeseburger and fries, while Jennifer chose a grilled chicken sandwich. Betty wrote down their order on a small pad and headed back to the kitchen, where she called out their request to the cook. As they waited for their food, Jennifer and David found themselves drawn into quiet conversation with some of the other customers. The family from the 1980s turned out to be the Andersons, who claimed to be driving from Kansas to visit relatives in California. The elderly man at the counter introduced himself as Frank, a retired farmer who said he was traveling to see his daughter in Florida. What struck Jennifer as odd was that all of the other customers seemed to be traveling long distances, much farther than would be typical for people stopping at a rural Texas diner. Moreover, when she asked about their specific routes, their answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. "We've been driving for days," Mrs. Anderson said with a weary smile. "Sometimes it feels like we've been on the road forever, just trying to get where we're going." Frank nodded in agreement. "The road can play tricks on you, especially at night. Sometimes you're not sure exactly where you are or how long you've been traveling." Their food arrived remarkably quickly, and both Jennifer and David were surprised by the quality. The cheeseburger was perfectly cooked, with a hand-formed patty that tasted like it had been made from freshly ground beef. The fries were crispy on the outside and fluffy on the inside, clearly cut from real potatoes rather than frozen. Jennifer's chicken sandwich was equally impressive, with tender meat and fresh vegetables on what appeared to be homemade bread. "This is incredible," David said between bites. "I wasn't expecting food this good in the middle of nowhere." Betty smiled as she refilled their coffee cups. "We take pride in our cooking here at the Starlight. Most of our ingredients come from local farms, and everything is made fresh daily." As they ate, Jennifer found herself studying the other customers more carefully. Something about the scene felt like a snapshot from another era, as if they had stumbled into a perfectly preserved piece of Americana. The conversations around them were subdued but pleasant, filled with the kind of polite small talk that characterized a simpler time. But as the evening progressed, Jennifer began to notice details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The family at the nearby booth had been eating the same meal since she and David had arrived, yet their plates never seemed to empty. The elderly man at the counter had been reading the same page of his newspaper for over an hour, his eyes moving across lines of text that never seemed to change. Most disturbing of all, Jennifer realized that none of the other customers had aged during their time in the diner. While she and David had been there for nearly 2 hours, the young children at various tables remained exactly as energetic as when they'd arrived, showing no signs of the fatigue that would typically affect kids so late at night. "David," Jennifer whispered, leaning across the table, "don't look around obviously, but have you noticed anything strange about the other people here?" David casually glanced around the diner, his expression gradually changing from casual interest to concerned confusion. "Now that you mention it, that family over there, haven't they been here the entire time we have? And they're still eating the same food?" Jennifer nodded, her appetite suddenly diminishing despite the excellent quality of her meal. "I think we should ask for the check and get going." When Betty returned to their table, David requested the bill. The waitress smiled warmly and pulled a small pad from her apron pocket, quickly scribbling their total. "That'll be $7.50 for everything," she said, tearing off the slip and placing it on their table. David stared at the check in disbelief. Even with the low menu prices, the total seemed impossibly small for 2 complete dinners with multiple coffee refills. He pulled out his wallet and placed a $10 bill on the table. "Keep the change," he said, standing up and helping Jennifer with her jacket. "Thank you kindly," Betty replied. "Y'all drive safe now. The road can be tricky at night, especially in these parts." As they walked toward the door, Jennifer felt compelled to look back at the diner one more time. What she saw made her grab David's arm and quicken her pace toward their car. Every customer in the restaurant had turned to watch them leave, their faces wearing identical expressions of wistful longing, as if they were watching something they desperately wanted but could never have. The bell chimed behind them as they exited, and they hurried across the parking lot to their Honda. David fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the doors. They climbed in quickly, and David started the engine with visible relief. As they pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, Jennifer turned to look back at the Starlight Diner. The building was still there, still glowing warmly in the darkness. But something had changed. The parking lot, which had been full of vintage vehicles when they arrived, now appeared completely empty except for the spaces where their car had been parked. "David, look back at the diner," Jennifer said, her voice tight with anxiety. David checked his rearview mirror and saw what Jennifer had noticed. The parking lot was deserted, and the building itself seemed to be flickering as if the neon sign were experiencing electrical problems. "That's impossible," David muttered. "There were at least a dozen cars there when we went in." They drove in silence for several minutes, both trying to process what they had experienced. Jennifer consulted their GPS and road atlas, searching for any mention of the Starlight Diner, but found nothing. According to every map and guide they had, there should have been no businesses at all in the location where they had just eaten dinner. "Maybe we should call someone," Jennifer suggested. "Report what we saw." "Report what exactly?" David replied. "That we found a diner that isn't supposed to exist, filled with people who might not be real." About 20 miles down the highway, they came across a 24-hour truck stop that matched the descriptions in their travel guide. David pulled in to fuel up and to give them both a chance to use the restrooms and collect their thoughts. Inside the convenience store, Jennifer approached the clerk, a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s. "Excuse me," she said. "We just stopped at a place called the Starlight Diner about 20 miles back. Do you know anything about it?" The clerk looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, there ain't no diner between here and the next town. This is the only place for about 50 miles in either direction." Jennifer described the location where they had found the diner, but the clerk shook his head. "I've lived here my whole life, and I know every building on this stretch of highway. There's nothing where you're describing except empty land." David joined the conversation, providing more details about their experience. but the clerk's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Folks," he said quietly, "you might want to talk to my manager. He's been working nights on this highway for 30 years, and he's heard stories like yours before." The manager, a weathered man in his 60s named Carl, listened to their account with serious attention. When they finished, he nodded slowly, as if their story confirmed something he had long suspected. "You're not the first people to tell me about the Starlight," Carl said. "Every few years, someone comes through here with the same story. A diner that appears at night, filled with customers from different time periods, serving food that's too good and too cheap for a place that doesn't exist." Carl led them to a corner of the store where he kept a collection of local history books and newspaper clippings. He pulled out a folder filled with yellowed papers and old photographs. There was a diner called the Starlight that operated along this highway back in the 1950s and 60s. Carl explained, showing them a black and white photograph of a building that looked exactly like the one they had just visited. It was a popular stop for travelers, known for its home-cooked food and friendly service. He showed them another photograph, this one from a newspaper dated night. The headline read, "Local diner destroyed in fire. 7 dead, including owner and staff." The fire started in the kitchen during the dinner rush. Carl continued. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the building was completely engulfed. 7 people died that night. The owner, 2 waitresses, the cook, and a family of 3 who were traveling through town. Jennifer and David stared at the photograph, which showed the charred remains of what had once been the Starlight Diner. The location matched exactly where they had just eaten dinner. Some folks believe that the diner still opens its doors to travelers. Carl said quietly, that the people who died there are still trying to serve one last meal, still hoping to help folks on their journey. Carl showed them more clippings, accounts from other travelers over the years who had reported similar experiences. All described the same details: the perfectly preserved 1950s atmosphere, the unusually low prices, the customers who seemed to be from different time periods, and the gradual realization that something was not quite right. "The thing is," Carl added, "everyone who's ever reported seeing the Starlight says the same thing about the food. It was the best meal they'd ever had, and everyone says the staff was incredibly kind and welcoming." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine as she thought about Betty, the waitress who had served them with such warmth and professionalism. "Do you think the people we met were the ghosts of the folks who died in the fire?" Carl said, "I don't know for sure, but I've heard enough stories over the years to believe that something unusual happens along that stretch of highway." David examined the newspaper photographs more closely, comparing them to his memory of their recent experience. The similarities were unmistakable, not just the building's architecture, but specific details like the placement of windows, the design of the neon sign, and even the layout of the interior. "Why do you think it appears to some people and not others?" David asked. Carl shrugged. "My theory is that it shows up for folks who need it most. People who are tired, hungry, far from home. The Starlight was always known for taking care of travelers, and maybe that's what it's still trying to do." Jennifer and David spent another hour at the truck stop, reading through Carl's collection of accounts and trying to process their experience. When they finally continued their journey, they drove with a new awareness of the mysteries that might exist along America's highway. They reached their planned destination without further incident, but neither of them slept well that night. Jennifer found herself thinking about Betty's kind smile and the genuine warmth of the service they had received. Despite the supernatural nature of their encounter, she realized that the Starlight Diner had provided exactly what they needed: a comfortable place to rest and refuel during their long journey. Over the following days, as they continued their cross-country trip, Jennifer and David found themselves paying closer attention to the stories behind the places they visited. They began to understand that the American road system was more than just a means of transportation. It was a repository of human experience, holding within its boundaries countless stories of joy, tragedy, and everything in between. They completed their journey to Miami as planned, but the experience at the Starlight Diner remained with them long after they returned home to Seattle. Jennifer began researching similar phenomena, discovering that ghost diners, phantom gas stations, and other supernatural roadside establishments were reported throughout the United States, usually along remote stretches of highway where tragedy had once occurred. The couple never returned to that particular route through Texas, but they often talked about their encounter with the Starlight Diner. They came to view it not as a frightening experience, but as a reminder that kindness and hospitality can transcend even death, and that some places hold on to their purpose long after they should have faded into history. Years later, when friends asked about the strangest thing that had happened during their cross-country trip, Jennifer and David would share the story of the midnight diner that shouldn't exist, where the dead continue to serve the living, offering comfort and sustenance to travelers who find themselves far from home in the darkness between destinations. Robert Chen had always prided himself on being a rational man. At 35, he was a successful accountant living in Portland, Oregon, with a methodical approach to life that left little room for superstition or belief in the paranormal. He drove a reliable Toyota Camry, maintained detailed records of all his expenses, and planned his routes with GPS precision. When his elderly aunt in Phoenix called to say she was entering hospice care and wanted to see him one last time, Robert immediately arranged time off work and began planning the most efficient route for the 12. The trip began on a crisp September morning in 2020, during a time when the world felt particularly uncertain due to the ongoing pandemic. Robert had chosen to drive rather than fly, partly due to health concerns, but mostly because he wanted time to think and prepare himself for what might be his final conversation with the woman who had helped raise him after his parents' divorce. The first day of driving took him through Oregon and into Northern California without incident. Robert stopped at predetermined intervals, refueled at carefully selected gas stations, and maintained a steady pace that would get him to Phoenix in 2 days. He had booked a room at a chain hotel in Bakersfield for the first night, with plans to complete the journey the following day. It was during the second day, while driving through a particularly desolate section of Interstate 5 in Central California, that Robert encountered something that would fundamentally challenge his rational worldview. The area was known for its harsh beauty, endless stretches of dry hills punctuated by oil derricks, and the occasional small town that seemed to exist primarily to serve the needs of passing travelers. Robert had been driving for about 3 hours since his last stop, listening to a podcast about financial planning, when he noticed a figure standing beside the highway ahead. As he drew closer, he could see that it was a young woman, probably in her 20s, wearing a simple white dress and holding what appeared to be a small suitcase. Her thumb was extended in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. Robert's first instinct was to drive. He had never picked up a hitchhiker in his life, considering it both dangerous and impractical. But something about the woman's posture suggested desperation, and as he passed her, he caught a glimpse of her face in his rearview mirror. She looked exhausted and possibly on the verge of tears. Against his better judgment, Robert found himself pulling over about 100 yards past where the woman was standing. He sat in his car for a moment, debating whether he was making a serious mistake, before finally putting the vehicle in reverse and backing up to where she was waiting. The woman approached his passenger side window, and Robert rolled it down partway. Up close, she appeared to be in her early 20s, with long brown hair and pale skin that suggested she had been walking in the sun for quite some time. Her white dress, while clean, appeared to be made of thin material that offered little protection against the California heat. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Robert couldn't identify. "I really need to get to Los Angeles. It's very important." Robert hesitated. Los Angeles was roughly in the direction he was traveling, though it would require a significant detour from his planned route to Phoenix. "What happened to your car?" he asked. The woman looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly around the handle of her small suitcase. "There was an accident," she said quietly. "I need to get to the hospital. My family is waiting for me." The mention of a family emergency struck a chord with Robert, who was making his own urgent journey to see a dying relative. He found himself nodding and reaching over to unlock the passenger door. I can take you as far as the junction with I-4. That should get you close enough to catch another ride or call someone to pick you up." The woman smiled for the first time since he had stopped. And Robert was struck by how beautiful she was when her face wasn't etched with worry. "Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to me." She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat with a grace that seemed almost ethereal. As she settled in and closed the door, Robert noticed that despite the oppressive heat outside, the interior of his car suddenly felt much cooler, as if the air conditioning had suddenly become more effective. "I'm Robert," he said as he pulled back onto the highway. "Maria," she replied, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Maria Gonzalez." As they drove, Robert attempted to make conversation, but Maria's responses were brief and often seemed disconnected from his question. When he asked about the accident that had stranded her, she would only say that it had happened a long time ago. When he inquired about her family in Los Angeles, she spoke about them in present tense, but with a sadness that suggested profound loss. "My little brother is waiting for me," she said at one point, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's so scared, and I promised I would be there for him." Robert found himself moved by her obvious distress and began to regret his initial reluctance to help her. Here was someone in genuine need, and he was in a position to provide assistance. It felt good to be doing something positive during what was otherwise an emotionally difficult journey. As the miles passed, however, Robert began to notice things about Maria that struck him as unusual. Despite the heat of the day, she showed no signs of perspiration, and her white dress remained pristine despite her claim of having been walking along the highway. More puzzling still, when he glanced at her in his peripheral vision, she sometimes seemed to be translucent, as if he could see the landscape passing by through her body. "Maria," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, "how long were you walking before I picked you up?" She turned to look at him directly for the first time since entering the car, and Robert was startled by the intensity of her gaze. Her eyes were dark brown, so dark that he couldn't distinguish the pupils from the irises, and they held an expression of infinite sadness. "I've been walking for a very long time," she said, "trying to get home, trying to reach my family before it's too late." Something about the way she said "too late" sent a chill down Robert's spine. He adjusted the car's temperature controls, but the interior continued to feel uncomfortably cold despite the bright sunshine streaming through the window. As they approached the area where Robert had planned to drop Maria off, she suddenly became agitated, gripping her small suitcase tightly and leaning forward in her seat. "Please," she said, her voice taking on an urgent quality. "You have to listen to me. There's something you need to know about the road ahead." Robert glanced at her, noting that her face had become even paler, if that were possible. "What do you mean?" "There's going to be an accident," Maria said, her words coming quickly now. "A terrible accident, just after the next curve. A truck driver will fall asleep at the wheel, and his trailer will jackknife across both lanes of the highway." Robert felt a spike of adrenaline. "How do you know this?" "It happens at 3:47 p.m., Maria said, checking a small watch on her wrist that Robert hadn't noticed before. "In exactly 12 minutes. If you continue at your current speed, you'll arrive just as it happens." Robert looked at his dashboard clock, which showed he found himself caught between skepticism and concern. How could Maria possibly know about an accident that hadn't happened yet? But something about her demeanor suggested she was absolutely certain of what she was saying. "You need to pull over," Maria continued, her voice becoming increasingly urgent. "Stop the car and wait for at least 20 minutes. Let the accident happen. Let the emergency crews arrive and clear the road. Only then will it be safe to continue." Robert's rational mind rebelled against the idea of making decisions based on the predictions of a hitchhiker he had just met. But something deeper than logic was telling him to take her seriously. There was something about Maria that defied normal explanation, and her knowledge of future events, if accurate, suggested she might possess information that could save his life. "How do you know this?" he asked again, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Maria was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I've been on this road before. Many times, I've seen what happens to people who don't listen to the warnings." Ahead of them, Robert could see a rest area with picnic tables and a small parking lot. Following an instinct he couldn't explain, he turned on his signal and pulled off the highway. As soon as he stopped the car and put it in park, Maria opened her door and stepped out. "Wait," Robert called after her. But she was already walking away from the car. She turned back to face him, and in the bright afternoon sunlight, Robert could clearly see through her translucent form to the desert landscape beyond. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. "And Robert? Yes. When you reach Phoenix, spend as much time as you can with your aunt. Tell her all the things you think you don't have time to say. You have more time than you think, but not as much as you hope." With that, Maria began to fade, becoming more and more transparent, until she vanished entirely, leaving behind only the small suitcase she had been carrying. Robert sat in his car, staring at the spot where she had disappeared, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He looked at his clock, 3:44 p.m. According to Maria's prediction, the accident would occur in 3 minutes. Robert found himself paralyzed by indecision. Should he continue driving and risk encountering the accident she had described? Or should he wait based on the word of someone who might not have been human? The decision was made for him by the sound of screeching brakes and the thunderous crash of metal meeting metal somewhere ahead on the highway. Even from the rest area, Robert could hear the unmistakable sounds of a major traffic accident. The screech of tires, the crunch of twisted metal, and the subsequent silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Robert grabbed his phone and dialed 911. Reporting the accident and providing the location as accurately as he could. Within minutes, he could hear the wail of sirens as emergency vehicles rushed toward the scene. He remained at the rest area for nearly an hour, watching as ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars passed by on their way to deal with the aftermath of the crash. When he finally felt it was safe to continue, Robert drove slowly past the accident scene. What he saw confirmed Maria's prediction with chilling accuracy. A massive semi-truck had jackknifed across both lanes of the highway, its trailer blocking all traffic. Emergency crews were still working to clear the wreckage and treat the injured. A highway patrol officer directing traffic around the scene told Robert that the truck driver had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel, causing the exact type of accident Maria had described. If Robert had continued driving at his normal speed, he would have arrived at that spot at precisely the moment of impact. The small suitcase Maria had left behind sat on his passenger seat, a tangible reminder of his supernatural encounter. When Robert opened it later at his hotel, he found it contained old photographs, documents, and personal items that appeared to date from several decades earlier. Among the papers was a newspaper clipping from 1987, describing a fatal car accident that had claimed the lives of Maria Gonzalez, age 23, and her younger brother, who had been traveling to Los Angeles to visit relatives. Robert spent the next 3 days with his aunt in Phoenix, and Maria's words about making time for important conversations proved prophetic. His aunt lived for another 6 months, during which Robert visited her regularly, sharing stories and memories he might never have thought to discuss if not for Maria's advice. The experience fundamentally changed Robert's worldview. He began to pay closer attention to intuition and instinct, recognizing that not everything in life could be quantified or explained through rational analysis. He kept Maria's suitcase, along with the newspaper clipping about her death, as reminders that the world contained mysteries beyond his comprehension. Robert never encountered Maria again, but he often thought about her during subsequent road trips. He began to research cases of vanishing hitchhikers and discovered that similar encounters had been reported throughout the United States for decades. In many cases, the ghostly passengers provided warnings about dangers ahead, using their supernatural knowledge to protect the living from the same fate that had claimed their own lives. He came to understand that Maria was likely one of many spirits who remained tied to the highways where they had died, continuing to serve travelers even in death. Her warning had saved his life, and her advice about spending time with his aunt had enriched his final months with the woman who had been such an important part of his childhood. The rational part of Robert's mind occasionally suggested that the entire encounter might have been an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But the suitcase remained real, the newspaper clipping was authentic, and the accident had occurred exactly as Maria had predicted. Some experiences, he learned, transcended the boundaries of logic and demanded acceptance on their own terms. Robert continued to drive long distances for both business and personal travel, but he never ignored his instincts again. When something felt wrong about a particular route or timing, he listened to that inner voice, remembering Maria's warning and the accident it had helped him avoid. The highway patrol officer he spoke with later told him that phantom hitchhikers were not uncommon along that stretch of Interstate 5, particularly near the site where Maria and her brother had died 3 decades earlier. Some folks say they're still trying to get home, the officer had explained. Others think they're trying to prevent other people from suffering the same fate. Robert preferred to think that Maria was motivated by compassion rather than being trapped by tragedy. Her final act had been one of kindness, using her supernatural knowledge to protect a stranger who had shown her courtesy in return. It was a reminder that human decency could transcend the boundaries between life and death, and that sometimes the most important journeys were not about reaching a destination, but about helping others along the way.